Yuva's work began in Bombay. And while initially the focus was on concerns of young people and housing specifically, over time Yuva expanded its work to different parts of the city. We started in Jogeshwari, but today we have work in right from Malad to the Sanjay Gandhi National Park. We have work in Bandra, in Parel, in the eastern suburbs, in Mankhurd, and also in Navi Mumbai. Specifically, if we look at our work in Bombay, I think the focus has been over the last 10 years has somewhat shifted to also include resettlement colonies in the eastern suburbs. We also work with in communities living in SRA buildings, because one also realizes that while people have shifted the way in which they live because of government policies, etc., the concerns of people remain largely the same. So Yuva's also evolved to sort of include different kinds of living conditions, but working on similar issues. And also over the last 10 to 15 years, we also expanded our work to Navi Mumbai, because the concerns of the urban poor are very similar to what one sees in Bombay. Of course, you have the same working class population, etc. The concerns of housing, labor are the same. A very common sort of figure that's always brought up now when you talk about migration is कि Bombay का जो population growth rate है, it's become a lot more static. You know, you're not seeing the kind of growth that you would see in the earlier decades. Of course, that's true, and if you look at the numbers, that's probably right as well. But what one sort of misses when you say that migration in Bombay has decreased is that you're not looking at it from a region perspective. You're not looking at it from a MMR, the Mumbai metropolitan region, which has, you know, 6 other cities as well and included within the MMR. So our work is, we have work in Navi Mumbai. You see slums really proliferating over there. The number of slums, Raju had mentioned the census data earlier. It's 18% of Navi Mumbai lives in slums, and that is an undercount, because we know many of the slums that we work in Navi Mumbai have not even been counted in by the census. So I mean, as you have Vasai Virar, where also we have some work there. Nala Sopara, Bastis in Nala Sopara, and maybe Raju can speak a lot more about that, is the number of people who live there are so much more, because they are able to find cheap, much more cheaper housing than you find in Bombay. And people are okay making that commute every day by train, spending 2 hours, 3 hours traveling from one end of the city to the other. So it's not okay to say migration in Bombay has become static. People are still coming here for work. Work is still available here, but housing is not. So housing is being sort of sought out in these peripheral areas where you have land, where, you know, the availability of getting cheaper housing, of course informal again, but is much higher. I think in popular imagination, the migrant is always conceived to be someone who has migrated from a village, is largely poor, and lives in an inadequate housing settlement in the city. Like, you won't call someone who has shifted to Bombay from any town or village and is living in an apartment in Bombay. They are never called migrant. So that imagination of the migrant is a poor person living in a slum. Of course, is largely also constructed to be a man. You know, when you say migrant, you're not thinking of a woman, you're not thinking of the children who are coming with that man. So that is one thing. The other the other imagination of the migrant, especially among bureaucracy and largely in the middle class, is that they have encroached. ये लोग illegal है, encroach किया गया है एक ज़मीन के ऊपर. They are encroachers. They are stealing water, they are stealing electricity, and they are not paying taxes. These are very common imaginations. So I think it's a very negative imagination of a migrant in the city. There is a gendered aspect to how vulnerable single women are in the city, especially women coming and searching for housing. That becomes their biggest question. Of course, we shouldn't only see gender as women. I think transgender communities, intersex people who live in the city as migrants their entire life, they can never have access to formal housing, they don't have access to services. They really are extremely vulnerable, especially even with the communities that we work in. You'll probably find them living on the fringes of those slum settlements. So I would definitely see gender and also the gender minority community as being extremely vulnerable in this entire sort of discourse on migration. then of course you also find children and young people who come either with their parents, or sometimes they just run away. We also have a lot of cases of young people who've just run away from their homes wherever they are. They come, they live on railway stations, they live, wherever they find place. There are horrible stories of the kind of atrocities they have to face on a daily basis that are almost internalized. They think that, I remember in fact, this is something that disturbed me so much. Once we were doing a session with children on the street, जो बच्चे रास्ते पे रहते हैं, and we told them, okay, do a street play of, a day of your life. And this girl, she was, I think, 11 or 12 years old, and they were enacting the situation of them having picked garbage the whole night and sleeping on the road. And they depicted, there were some girls only who depicted being older boys or older men who would just come and harass them horribly while they're sleeping on the road. And this girl just normalized it and said, हाँ तुम रास्ते पे रह रहे हो तो obviously rape होगा. I mean, she didn't say obviously, but she said, हाँ rape तो होगा ही ना. And it was almost like she had internalized the fact that if I'm a young woman sleeping on the road, this is my reality, this is what I have to live with. So I think even understanding a children's perspective, a young girl's perspective to being a migrant in the city is very important, and somehow always forgotten in this larger discourse. In terms of looking at the migrant as the urban poor living in the city, I think the state looks largely at enumeration, documentation of who this person is, who is this person living in the city. And to that effect, of course, they have, you have the census, you have different forms of enumeration that the local municipal corporation does as well. But to actually give them some proof for the fact the migrant worker in the city actually uses legal identity documents as a way in which they can claim some right to the city. So you have the easiest right now to get, maybe, say for example, it's not easy, but a bank account, or maybe an Aadhaar card if there's an Aadhaar camp somewhere, or for example a PAN card that you'll get after you have an Aadhaar card. Of course, a voter's ID card and a ration card are much more difficult to get than the others. So somehow, with the state conceiving the migrant as this person who needs to be, constantly monitored, you need to understand कि वो लोग क्या कर रहे हैं, कहाँ पे जा रहे हैं, कहाँ पे रह रहे हैं. It's also the migrant also seeking this form of legal identity document so that the state recognizes them. So only once, in fact, there's a link, only once someone who's moved to the city and has some purava, some document to show that I live here, over here, this is my house, this is my gully number, this maybe if you're lucky it has a house number, can I then access, one is some sort of housing scheme, I can then access water, I can then have a bathroom in my house, I can have a toilet in my house. So there's a link between a migrant coming to the city, the state wanting to enumerate that person, sort of have a watch over the person through a variety of ways, and then the person itself wanting to legalize himself or herself and say that I have this document, now I am entitled to basics, the most basic rights for that matter. I have a right to shelter, I have a right to water, now that I have these documents, which itself is so problematic because these are human rights. They're enshrined in our constitution. Everyone has the right to life. But here in the city, the migrant needs to prove who they are and prove themselves through documentation, which itself is very problematic. And of course, specifically in Bombay, if you look at, I'm sure it's often spoken about, is the entire cut-off date, and how that itself is it's a huge vote bank. Like I mentioned earlier, it's political. Of course, the elections are coming up. If we are lucky, the cut-off date will be extended again, and a whole number of people will finally be able to access, housing or some sort of security of their life in the city. So yeah, you have the cut-off date, and then one is, okay, you have the cut-off date, you have a documentation proof that says you live before the cut-off date. But then the scheme that the government brings in, does it also exclude people? Because very often, for example, right now you have the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, which is the central government housing scheme. That says that, and the current Prime Minister has also said कि सबको घर मिलना चाहिए by 2020. But if you look through the details of that policy document, what does it really say? One of the first things the scheme guideline says, you cannot have a house anywhere else in the country. Now, everyone is coming to the city. Maybe you have even a shack in the village, but if you have that, you're not entitled to a, you're not entitled to upgrading your house in the city, which is, I mean, it's unfair, because that's what the government is saying, everyone needs to have a house, but they're saying, but no, if you have a house anywhere else, you're not getting a house here. The other thing that the scheme guideline says is you need to meet the cutoff date. Now there's so many people who are in actual need of housing who don't live within the cutoff date. So while you have the central government coming up with all these, you know, grandiose plans for giving everyone a house, but in reality, if you look into, read between the lines, not even read between the lines, you just read what these documents are saying, they are not including people, they are actually excluding those who need housing and basic services the most. Invariably you will have two or three people come up to you and say, please mera form bharo. Why do they do that? Because they are not able to even understand those forms. So you need to see that, ठीक है, you can give as many schemes, you can give as many welfare policies, but people are just not being able to access it because of this documentation issue. And that's why Yuva really forms that link. Also because, of course, when we speak of the right to housing, the right to habitat, documentation becomes the key. No state will ever provide you with adequate housing if you're not able to show your Aadhaar card now. Actually, you can't forget a house, you can't even upgrade your own house through a state scheme if you don't show you have an Aadhaar card today. And Aadhaar card is used for everything. Every welfare policy by the state needs an Aadhaar card today. So, I mean, it's okay for us to have our views on Aadhaar, but for someone living as a poor person in the city, the Aadhaar becomes their only way to claim welfare, claim anything basic. Even if you're born in the city today, the first thing that they request all parents to do is make an Aadhaar card for the child. Yeah. We run BSFCs in different cities. We have BSFCs in Guwahati, Bhubaneswar, Indore. So one thing that we are seeing in through the BSFC in Guwahati is, because over the last few months with the entire NRC debate that has come out, even over there, okay, I mean, there in Assam it is extremely political, and I'm no one to really speak about it because I'm not from there and I don't really know the issue in detail. But what we see through the basic service facilitation center that runs out of slums in Guwahati, yes, there have been people who are Assamese, they are of Indian origin, but they have no proof that their grandparents or their parents lived in India, because very often they were living in places where it was ecologically sensitive. The floods have washed away whatever little documentation they have. And again, you have to fill up a form. None of them know how to fill up the form. So a lot of our colleagues there were helping them for a lot of time just to fill up forms to prove that they are citizens of India and their grandparents, parents, ancestrally they've lived here. So, I mean, and of course, when it comes to Bombay and you see people speak in Bengali here, it's a very common thing to say that ye log Bangladeshi hai. We have also faced many cases of the police coming, arresting people, saying they're Bangladeshis, putting them in lockup. Of course, the lockup often happens largely to men. We have not come across too many cases of locking up women. Maybe there are, I mean, we've not come across them. And then there's an entire court procedure. That court procedure is also a big farce. Of course, there's a fear. If you can't prove that you're Indian, you will be put into some jungle, they'll deport you. We've not seen that happen, but there is this fear of people who speak Bengali saying that the government can at any point, you know, just call us Bangladeshis, and we have no proof at that moment. In terms of accessing housing in the city, it is extremely difficult for a single woman to access housing in the city, especially if you don't have some sort of capital to pay, you know, a huge deposit or pay off the rents that are so high in the city. So that is the first challenge. The other thing is, if you are a single woman who's living with your parents and you want to have access to a housing scheme, the housing scheme will only enable access, I mean, will give priority to the head of the household. The name will probably be, the house will be in the name of the head of the household. And if you're lucky, of course, the wife as well, though that's not the case in all housing schemes. And of course, who inherits that house? It becomes the son. If of course there is a daughter as well in the house, as well as in the household, the policy doesn't say that this should be given to the daughter, or there's no specific mention of what happens to the girl of the household, especially in a housing scheme. The other thing that one sees in terms of gender and how women have been able or are trying to make a a claim to the city is through the development plan, the recent development plan that has been released. So for the first time, the Municipal Corporation of Mumbai accepted that yes, there is a low workforce, working women's workforce in the economic capital of the country. And to that effect, through advocacy initiatives of many groups and organizations, they have finally agreed to reserve land for, one is hostels for working women, care centers, because a lot of the times women are not able to enter the workforce because of household responsibilities and caregiving duties that they have at home. So they've also agreed to reserve land or space in the city for care centers, for skilling facilities where women can come, they can learn skills, they can start up their own businesses. So one is okay that the government has done through planning initiatives, but how that's actually going to get translated on the ground, how they're going to be operationalized, we just hope that the municipal corporation doesn't say that you need to prove, then you need to show some form of documentation again to be able to access this hostel facility or multi-purpose housing. That's another thing that has been reserved. So one doesn't know how it will be translated. Of course, at the level of urban planning, these reservations have come into force, and that is progressive. But in terms of the real challenges of women entering the city to work, there are many, especially if you are a woman who's entering the informal workforce as a street vendor or a construction worker or a domestic worker for that matter, what Raju spoke about earlier. Of course, it's the most easiest form to take to street vending, but what are the challenges that you face as a street vendor? So in terms of culture, we look at it through narrative building and how do you change narratives of different people. It's not easy to use the confrontation approach, which very often civil society organizations are sort of trapped by, that it's always an us versus them, they are the other, we are a certain way, etc. So using culture, whether it is the medium of music, the medium of street theater that we use in communities, mediums of photography, and through complexity, that's an event that we have every year. Over the last 2 years we've had it. How do we get different groups in the city to converse on inequalities, for that matter? So for example, we'll have a photography competition that we keep open to youth who we work with in settlements and youth from colleges, colleges that maybe a more middle class population frequents. And how do they come and present inequalities through photography and then have a conversation about it? Or for that matter, have cultural performances that are generally not seen to be, culturally you expect only a certain kind of woman to being a lavani dancer. But when you see a trans person doing a lavani dance, how does that change, your idea of what is right and what is wrong? And it's we find this whole thing of narrative building and working with the other in the city extremely important, because otherwise we just end up working in silos and it's just us versus them, us in our bubble talking to similar organizations, similar academicians, when the city is developing a certain way without these conversations being part of it. So sort of marrying the two worlds, I would say, that create this unequal city. Like we talk about two cities within one, but what are we doing to bridge that gap between these two cities?
I see my work really over the past 20 years or so located at the intersection of several things. At one level between academics and practice. The second also at an intersection between housing, urban poverty, infrastructures to the poor, the overall notion of informality, and linked to all of this, the overall politics, the sociology, the popular movements linked to the city, and overall trying to create a consistently progressive city by engaging both at the grassroots level as well as with policymakers. So that's where I think a lot of my work sits and has been an attempt. In terms of just looking at this and reflecting upon myself also as a person in terms of the topic that you are archiving, I'm born in a small village in Maharashtra called Vai, and then spent all my life in Mumbai. So, if one goes by the one of the parameters of the census definition of who is a migrant, then one of the parameters is ki, have you been enumerated in a census in a place which is different from your place of birth, then yes, I am a migrant. But on the other hand, I have never ever considered myself a migrant. I consider myself extremely rooted in this city's culture, its experience, its urbanity, and as a contributing citizen to all levels of this city's discourse. In fact, I think the city has been a lot of the base of my academic work as well. The description and definition of a migrant, I think, is one of the most contested arenas, especially in contemporary India, but I would also say several parts of the world. Looking at this through a little bit of a political economic lens, the very idea of defining a migrant comes from the notion and a bias towards sedentariness, which lays a lot of value on not moving at all and being rooted in a place throughout your life. Reality was never this. I think migration perhaps is as age old as settlement, but the way it has evolved in I would say academic discourse, also in the policy domain, is like the world has always been sedentary and that migration is a deviation. There are countries which have very successfully, very powerfully dampened and tried to control migration. One example of this from colonial times is when you see the entire experience of South Africa, where the colonial settlers wanted people and black labor to work in their cities, but they did not want black labor to settle in the cities, and which is why there have been elaborate licensing policies to even enter the city, which were created in countries like in continents like Africa, but especially today in today's nations like South Africa. Come to China, a different part of the world, and there is this entire policy of the hukou, which ties people to places where they were born in, where they are expected to educate themselves, where they work in, and where they have entitlements by this document called hukou. So there are several people who understand hukou as just a license to migrate. It is not that. It is actually an entire set of entitlements which are tied together, and which is why people cannot be separated from their birthplace or places where they have a hukou to. Further, the discouragement to migration was to such an extent that even to move to a higher level of education or to move to a city, there were only limited numbers of hukous which were made available. Okay. So, this is, I think, the height of controlling migration. In India, we see a very contrary experience, where the Indian Constitution talks of the freedom of movement as part of the constitutional values. and therefore we don't have these kind of anti-migration, anti-migrant policies in theory. On the other hand, what we have done is we have assumed sedentariness, and this assumed sedentariness actualizes in the form of all our welfare policies, several of our entitlement policies, which are operationalized at the state level. The minute we say that, just to give examples of all of this, the public distribution system, the food, the ration cards are all issued by the state governments. The entitlements for that food come from the state governments. If we look at housing, entitlements come from the state government, the actual provisioning of it. If we look at education, then to take admission into any kind of professional college, you require domicile certificates, where you define the requirement of a domicile as spending of minimum of 14 years in a particular place. Right. So, when we look at this, the freedom of movement remains a constitutional value, but the actualization is absolutely not there. This creates, what we are seeing after the 1990s and the advent of globalization is basically that the unevenness in the spatialization of development has increased tremendously, and which means that you do not have growth happening everywhere. You have particular centers, mostly urban centers, cities emerging as nuclei of growth. Okay. So, on one hand you have a pattern of development which is so uneven. You will only create resources and opportunities in very few sites, and this is what sets in a necessity, almost like a compulsion to migrate. On the other hand, the policies which are necessary to actually go hand in hand with the mobility which is created are totally absent. So, I think, and to me this is very disconcerting, because at one level today in India we talk about cities as engines of growth, right? But cities as engines of growth for whom? Right. So, the census has two definitions of how it defines migration. One is ki if your current place of enumeration is different from your place of birth, okay, you are a migrant. The second is if your current place of enumeration and residence is different from the place of residence in the last census. So, if the latest census is the 2011 census and I am enumerated in a place as a place of residence which is different from the one in the last census, then I am a migrant. But the minute the focus is on this place of residence, and the way I am asking this, there are two things that it produces. That within a span of 10 years, there are several mobilities which are carried out, and therefore the census is unable to capture all of these movements which are less than 10 years, okay, or it is unable to capture all of the movements which do not involve a permanency of residence, residential shift. So, everything else gets ignored. So, one of the big issues which several academics as well as civil society practitioners are talking about today is migration in India. Even when we talk about it in terms of statistics, is not seen to be a significant number at all. Okay. And in fact, civil society practitioners and researchers, at least a few of them, believe that migration is seriously undercounted in India. because of this definitional bias towards sedentariness. The same applies also to the NSSO, which is our other major statistical tool, and how that defines migration. And the NSSO has now become a little more flexible, but it still talks of a shift within the last 6 months. Okay. In a country which has become so mobile that you have many different patterns of mobility. To give one example from the perspective of Mumbai, today, every day in Mumbai, you have commuters coming in from as far as Surat in Gujarat, which is an interstate movement, from Nasik on the central railway side, or even from Pune, right? And several others. So, each of these is at a distance of 160, 180, 200, more than that kilometers away, right? So, these are not regular commuters. Okay. So, this is one big pattern of mobility. This I am talking about Mumbai just now, but this is the same experience which is also the experience of Nagpur, which attracts migrants of this everyday nature from 3 neighboring states: Andhra Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh. Okay. Delhi, which attracts migrants from Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, Punjab and Rajasthan. Right. So, when we look at these, so this everyday commuting, long commuting, then there are shorter stays or seasonal migration, and the number of that is also immense. In fact, some statisticians based on NSSO data today estimate that the number of seasonal migrants in India may be anywhere close to about 12 million or a little above that. Okay. So, 12 million seasonal migrants. If you look at these long commuters, okay, that is also extremely significant number, and I think just to the city of Mumbai, and if you look at and trace some of these move to around again 12 to 15 million of everyday commuters, not just to Mumbai, but overall within the country. And then you are looking at the more longer term migrants, but that too then within a span of this 1 to 10 years, which is the census gap, right. So, how much of this is actually understood by the census, how much of this is measured by the census. So, at the first level, when we talk about who is a migrant, I think all of these can be migrants, but at the same time a good proportion of them can also be seen as settlers. There are several students who come to cities like Mumbai. Even in our own Tata Institute of Social Sciences, I would say that the proportion of people from Mumbai or proportion of people from Maharashtra is less than 10-15%, I guess. And I am not coming here as a localite or carrying a bandwagon for so much share for so much state, but that is the proportion, which means that we have roughly 85% who are coming from other states or perhaps even out of the country. Fair enough. How many of these actually settle back in the city and how many of these go back to their original hometowns? Okay. I have never seen any of these students think of themselves as migrants. Okay. They consider themselves legitimate citizens of the city. They may stay on rent, they may stay on sub-rents, they may stay on subcontracts. Okay. On the other hand, the minute you talk about the informal sector, the minute you talk about poorer citizens, okay, they are considered as migrants forever. Okay. So, the entire discourse around slums is built around outsiders coming in, constantly migrating to the city, every day more than what 240 or 400, I do not know what this is the latest number which is thrown, people coming to Mumbai from trains, overcrowding the city, putting a big strain on the city's services and infrastructure, and all of these are informal sector. Okay? And so then you will have political bandwagons which will say stop migration to the city, and there will be different waves of migrants specifically against whom it is directed. But my point is, everyone is a migrant, right? If in fact, if I look among my fellow academics, including myself, as I said, you define me in terms of census, I am a migrant. Okay? But I have spent more than 50 years of my life in Mumbai. So do I still continue to be a migrant? Or was my father a migrant? He spent his entire childhood in Konkan and then was educated in his college years in Mumbai. He worked in Mumbai. So is he a migrant? He is a so, but they are not called migrants. Neither am I called a migrant in these discourses. Cities are made, I think, if we shift from here to looking at the entire relationship between cities and migrants, cities are made and constructed by migrants. And when I say constructed, not just in terms of physical construction, but I think the contribution to the economy, the contribution to the overall social life, if the city is all about diverseness, bringing things together and therefore becoming a site and a hub of innovation and tension and all of this, then migration has a lot to do with it. Migration is inbred into the idea of a city. In fact, even if we take a single peek back into the city's history, then the colonial history of the city tells you that the British deliberately encouraged Gujaratis and Parsis to migrate into the city through policies which were very, very akin to today's SEZ policies. But they brought them in. Why did they bring them in? Because they saw in some ways that the indigenous populations of the city were not ones on whom a urban economy can be built. The kind of port economy they wanted, the kind of enterprise which was necessary for that, the kind of investment which was necessary for that was not present here, and hence the migrants. The migrant is also wanted in the city of the poorer kind as well for labor in the city. So again, two interesting stories here is when the RML colony was constructed to provide milk for the entire British army during the World War, they had no people who would agree to stay in the jungle and maintain all of this cattle and who had the skills of dairying. Okay. They therefore deliberately encouraged groups of Tamilians to actually come and settle into the RA dairy. The first groups of migrants were sent with messages back home, bring more people like you. Okay. So it's a very, very powerful story. Or a second story of the mills. And within the mills, where I am from Konkan, my native place is in Konkan, and so the relationship between Konkan and Mumbai in terms of migration stretches back again to the colonial period. The stories go that initially people from Konkan were also reluctant to stay in Mumbai, just as the Britishers faced difficulties in staying in this big bad city called Mumbai with all the mangroves and the malaria and the infrastructure which was still getting developed. The people from Konkan also did, because they lived in even poorer conditions. They were being fleeced in work. The mill owners, in order to incentivize the workers to stay back, actually constructed the chawls in the vicinity of work. Perhaps today when we talk of SEZs, we talk of integrated work, live-in kind of spaces. But to me, the mill chawls were one of the first integrated live work kind of places, bad ones, because the conditions of living were not necessarily very good, but they tried to create some kind of even a cultural midway between the culture, the group culture of a village and the individualization of the city. And in that sense, the chawls proved a very good solution to that. But the chawls are a way of encouraging migration. They also created personnel policies so that large numbers of mill owners, mill workers who wanted to go back to their villages at times of festivals could do so. So, the entire system of Badli Kamgars, people who could replace them, was born out of this. Okay. My point is, the city needs migrants. I think increasingly, I would say, policies within Mumbai and also for several other urban policies. I don't want to make this far reaching claim, but I do see several overlaps, have sedentarized. They have not remained dynamic. That we are making Mumbai more and more exclusive, and in doing so, we have done that by ignoring several kinds of knowledges. Just to give an example, we statistics today says that census says 49% of the city lives in slums. There are other more non-official statistics, including those given by the municipal corporation, which put it at 60%. The fact is that the city's policies are more and more oriented to only those who are property owners in the city. So, slum becomes the space for uncertain property rights or claims which are different, right? Claims made more through effort and through a different kind of a non-monetized relationship to land and land making. The second, they have also become more oriented towards permanency. So, even when we thought, I gave you the example of chawls and the mills earlier, chawls were not thought of as permanent ownership places. They were thought of as rental places. But today we don't rent, leave alone rents. We don't even think of daily housing needs. So, like if you have resources like hospitals here, educational institutions here, you are going to have people who are going to have different temporal needs of residence. So, whether it is patients and their relatives. So, patients can stay in a hospital, but what about their relatives who are very necessary for the entire support system which patients have, or patients who are chronically ill and therefore who may not be kept in the hospital, but who need to be in and out of the hospital on a regular basis. Or think of educational institutions where you have a space for about 1 or 2 years where you are going to be here, or a little longer. Or you may have single working women, or even families for that matter, who may need to think of that I will spend about 5-6 years of my working life here, but I do not want to get settled in this city. There may be several people in this space. But Mumbai as a city is becoming increasingly closed to these kind of options. And all of this brings in a huge bias. The slum to me has become a crucible or a kind of a space where several of these flexibilities actually exist. Okay. So, on one hand we have the city which is losing flexibility, losing dynamism, has no understanding of what happens here, and on the other hand you have the slum which becomes the crucible of what exists here. And I think this is something which is very interesting. So, the knowledge of everything that happens in a slum, how do you create the infrastructure? Okay. Does all infrastructure have to be linked to centralized networks, putting in big sewer lines, and which will then require thousands of dollars and then loans and whatever. Okay. And here are people who are putting up small things, okay, making do with so many whatever resources which are available. There is rain, so you put up two big drums in which water is collected. Okay. So, the big city is still unable to do rainwater harvesting, but this is how rainwater is harvesting is done in slums, perhaps because there is no option, but it is done. Right? Or you think of several ways in which, small ways in which infrastructure is being done really, something which the city is living incomplete. And today, to me, it is these kind of ways where one can become more symbiotic. One needs to at once learn from these without becoming romantic about it. Like, I am not trying to glorify what happens in a settlement here, but at the same time there are several compulsions which drive people to think of small, interim, uncertain. These are terms which are getting lost to the city. A lot of thinking about why MWARD, why is MWARD so poor, is all about MWARD is the edge ward of the city, and as an edge ward you receive a whole lot of migrants to the city, and all these illegal migrants, often Bangladeshi migrants or North Indian migrants, it is they who make up this place, and therefore this is a space of illegal existence. So, you should not provide much service, and so that is how the entire narrative goes. I think even the 2011 survey, which was done by all the students in TISS as the foundation of the MWARD project, showed that neither do we have a dominance of North Indian populations, nor do we have a predominance of Bangladeshi populations, and neither do we have a dominant presence of migrants. Okay. And I am talking about migrants because the bulk of the populations here are those who have stayed in this ward for more than 15 years. Even more than half of them have spent more than 40 years in the city. Okay. So, one is about the ward. In the ward they have spent more than 10 years, bulk of them, and then in the city they have spent more than 40 years. So, what does this tell about MWARD then? It basically tells you that you were unable to do something about the first generation issue of housing. Okay. And those people remained so vulnerable that they were unable to find formal housing solutions even in their second generation, and therefore they had to go back to finding housing in slums. So, the slum, which was originally thought of as that transitionary space into the city, where the first migrants come, then they will settle, and after that they will become part of the mainstream city fabric. We have not been able to do that. Instead, what has happened is, your second generation stays in a slum, your third generation perhaps will also stay in a slum. And that is the heterogeneity of the slum that MWARD project consistently sees, and that is our experience, and that is what we are trying to counter constantly. Okay. So, if your third generation is staying in slums, it is going to actually change the nature of the narrative very differently, because their aspirations are not like the first generation migrant. Their aspirations are going to be very different. They are urban citizens. Popular discourse and mainstream discourse may call them migrants, but to me they are not migrants. Even a formal condition of domicile says 14 years. When you have a third generation living here, how come they will be migrants? But I think this is a city really today which is reducing and moving far away from its elasticity in every matter. Just, I think, one of the most contemporary issues that we are discussing in the city today is that which is linked to vendors. And there are these vending zones which are being created for the hawkers or the street vendors. Now, within which the Bombay Municipal Corporation has introduced a clause of domicile. Okay. What does that mean? Ki a hawker will get a pitch in a vending zone only if they are able to prove that they have been in the city for more than 14 years. Okay. So, if one is accepting in some ways that street vending or professions like this are going to be spaces by which poor migrants with the least amount of skills find entry points into the city. But what are we doing? We want to abolish those entry points, okay? Instead close them off. And to me, all of these are actually examples by which actually illustrate that this city is losing its elasticity. That's not the sign of a good city to me. Civil society has indeed played an extremely strong role in firstly identifying issues of different kinds of migrants. Okay. So, sometimes it is construction workers, sometimes it is people who work on roads and the interstate migrants. There are other kinds of brick kiln workers and people who may work in factories and all of that. And there are others who have worked on it and given it other names, perhaps a little more general category called a migrant worker. There are still others who have preferred to give it the name of homeless, which is coming at it from a residential and the shelter angle. But I think all of these are issues which are also connected. So, I see this both as a potential and as a problem. So, the role of civil society has been to visibilize these issues of different vulnerable groups into the city, many of whom happen to also be migrants. Okay. They have also been able to think about what are the possible needs of these people from the city, and also think about what are the contribution that these groups make to the city. Okay. Having said that, the limitation of civil society has also been that it has fragmented different groups. So, there are organizations who are working on migrants. There are organizations who are working on the homeless. There are organizations who are working on street children and pavement dwellers and slums, and there are organizations who are working with construction workers and naka workers. Okay. But all of these are never tied together, and this narrative remains separate from the entire political narrative of migration, the policy narrative of migration. And here is where I feel academia plays a role. And I do think academia needs to, by itself perhaps academia will not even think about these issues. The primary disciplines who have been concerned with migration have been demographics and economics, demography and economics. Both of them have basically not been concerned, one in terms of finding numbers of migration and the other looking at causes for migration and the Todaro theories and so on and so forth. Okay. But they have created a very linear, a very half picture of migration. It is the integration and connection, I would say not integration, but perhaps interconnection with civil society, which has produced more fascinating results. Like one of the most path-breaking works that I see in the entire field of migration is the one which has been done by Priya Deshinkar, and where Priya Deshinkar basically on the basis of several micro studies and micro movements estimated that the number of short term migrants in India is easily anywhere around 100 million or so. Okay. Now, the minute one comes to that, it begins to establish the statistical significance of this kind of a figure. But otherwise, it's something which never strikes through. And I think it is at this edge that perhaps I would suggest two things. Number one, we need to bring in many more disciplines into the entire field called migration. Secondly, to create this kind of more complex perhaps, but also more integrative picture of migration at different levels, statistically, but also in terms of the cultures, the lives, the entire phenomenology of how the city is experienced and the relationship between the migrants and the city.
I'm with the School of Media and Cultural Studies. Prior to I was also an administrator, apart from being a dean, research and development, and being a faculty with the Center for Women's Studies. So broadly, my areas of work have always been on gender, health, employment, and public policy. Now, as part of the school, I have started exploring, looking at smartphones and their use among young people, and also looking at feminist internet. Being a social scientist actually gives you an interesting opportunity to self-reflexively connect to everyday aspects of life and try and inquire it from the lens of academia. That kind of engagement actually tells you sometimes the limitations of the concepts that we have, and also enables you to push the envelope, to rethink concepts from the lives of people, and particularly women in my case. So as part of my PhD, where I have done my field work in East Godavari district, I found that women along with their families migrate actually to various places for work. They are into seasonal migration, they are into circular migration, they are into short distance migration, they are into long distance migration. So migration therefore is a very essential aspect of their lives, and it's linked to their coping strategies. So while doing that research, I kept hearing lots of them saying that they migrate into Mumbai, and from Mumbai they go to the Middle East, essentially where men work as maybe drivers, mechanics, and women work as household helps. So after I joined TIS as a faculty, then I was actually wondering, is there any way of locating these migrants at the place of destination? So while doing my field study, I kept hearing the word Andheri Pump House as the place where people come to stay. And I met with people, and then I asked for, are there Telugu speaking people here? And they often refer to them as Kamati Log. And that's quite interesting. And when I asked, why are Telugu speaking people called Kamati? Then they told me that the term Kamatipura comes from the term Kam Mattika. So people who have done work with mud, essentially the ones who have contributed to the city as construction laborers, they are referred to as Telugu people, or let's say Telugu people are referred to as those people who do construction work. So I located a lot of Telugu people and spoke to them, and then that led me to looking for other Telugu people in the city, and essentially the low income people. And then I found that there are Telugu people in the BDD chawls and these are Telugu speaking people who belong to the Padmasali community, and many of them come from Telangana, erstwhile undivided Andhra, but they come from Telangana. And they also Telugu speaking people in Kamatipura, and they identify as people who contributed to the construction of very many monuments in the city, the big hospitals and the Gateway of India, etc. And the ones in BDD Chawls contributed to the textile industry. So they were from the handloom sector who moved into the power loom. So, and the ones who are in the Andheri pump house are at absolutely the fringes of the Mumbai economy, and they go into international migration. So therefore you find within the city a variety of migrants. Some are recent, some are very old. A lot of them continue to maintain their traditional moorings, their language, their cuisines, their clothing, etc., but intermingle and contribute to the city in a big way. So while doing that study and talking to women in the BDD Chawls, I had this interesting observation where the older women said that they actually were workers. They contributed as construction workers, or they worked in the textile mills, and then later moved into staying home. And the women of the current times, when I did my research, actually were talking about getting back into doing some kind of work, and essentially they cook food and they run messes from home and earn a living beyond what they're able to earn with a single male who was earning earlier. And women often refer to this as troubled times. And then I was actually exploring this whole concept in sociology that looks at migration and occupational mobility. And upward mobility and downward mobility are the ways in which occupational mobility is measured. And you'd find that if you were to move from regular employment to casual or irregular employment, or you become unemployed, that is definitely an downward mobility. Whereas from a casual, irregular, you move into a more regular, salaried kind of employment, that's an upward mobility. But in the case of women, in fact, they look at it completely the other way around. That is, if they become stay-home women, housewives, they see that as an upward mobility, because that has led to they from the public domain to actually moving into the private domain, and the men moving from a lower income to a higher income. And getting back into employment, they see it as a downward spiral, because now they are into troubled times and one income is no good. So they need to pitch in and do something to be able to earn an income. So the perception of looking at the relationship between employment and the kind of status that you look at, which comes from, even mainstream academic research, where women's employment and role are seen as something that contribute directly to their higher status. In rural areas, it's actually the other way around. Women who work are definitely not the ones who come from propertied classes. They are the ones who come from the laboring and working classes. And for them, work and employment are really not options, but they are just no option kind of choice. So that mindset continues even when migrants come into the city. And you find that they continue to look at work as something that indicates their low position in society, compared to looking at it as something that's providing them an option and also an access to life choices. What has been my experience of the Working Women's Hostel, which directly told me something about being a migrant single woman, as opposed to the experiences of poor low-income women, migrant women, and their experiences. What this tells you is, in my case, probably being single and being a migrant hyper visibilizes my sexuality. And in the case of the poor woman, in fact, their citizenship gets hyper visibilized. So if I were to put it in other words, across the spectrum within which women are located, their access to the city does not come with any natural rights and entitlements. Their rights and entitlements are continuously hampered by a lot of perspectives that society holds about they being good women, they being good wives, or they being good mothers. So, interestingly, then I was looking at women in the M Ward slum, and I was once participating in their discussion on access to water. They have at this point of time an interesting campaign which is called Right to Pee, but prior to that there was a large campaign that they were having around right to water. And interestingly, in that discussion, what came to my mind, or the observation that I came across, was to gain access to water, you have to be living in a slum that's considered to be recognized by the BMC. So, the women who live in slums which are not recognized by the BMC, for them it's not easy to get water. So, as per the norms, then BMC expects them to actually come together, file an affidavit and deposit money so that there can be a pipeline that gets laid so that they can get water. So, for many of those women who live in unrecognized slums, therefore, getting water is also a way of getting a right to the city and being recognized as a citizen who can ask for that water, you know. And it's quite interesting because in feminist literature we have this interesting ways of looking at various aspects in the development discourse, whether it's water or fuel wood or childcare, etc. They're often seen as whether they are addressing gender practical needs or gender strategic needs. So, water in that sense, in that hierarchy of practical needs and or strategic needs and practical needs, comes at the bottom as being a practical need for women. However, here I have seen that trying to gain access to water, women are strategically approaching their practical need for water. And that strategic negotiation is actually negotiating a citizenship rights. So, while women who come from the educated classes and belong to, more let's say middle class, upper class, etc., in fact their concerns are not so much around issues of citizenship, but lower the hierarchy that you go, higher is the negotiation with citizenship rights. And I think the vulnerability also is pans out differently in each of these groups. At this point of time, India is actually grappling with a very interesting question, which we often refer to as a conundrum. With the increasing education of women, there is no direct increase in the labor force participation. Okay, one actually expects that with increased education, you also would have higher employment rates, but actually there is a declining labor force participation. So, this is a conundrum. Different people try and give different explanations and attempt to actually grapple with how do you increase the labor force participation. I have been working on this subject for a long time, and one interesting idea that I am actually exploring along with CORO, which is a non-governmental organization located in M East Ward in Mumbai, to see the relationship between women's work participation to the kind of domestic responsibilities that they have, and whether they have all aspects of their life covered in a way that enables them to take up any kind of income earning work. So, we are doing a very small pilot trying to look at what are the kind of timings that they get their water supply, what are the timings of schools, and in what ways are women tied up to carrying on a lot of these domestic responsibilities. Apart from cooking, cleaning, washing, their major work also is about fetching water and reaching their children to school and bringing them home, and trying to see whether it gives them enough time to take up employment or they are tied up because of these, that is what we were looking at. And we do find that practically in all the locations within the M East ward, drinking water is not supplied at the same time. It's supplied at any time during the day, and it can also be at any time at night, and this fluctuates the entire year. Then children go to school, and they go to a variety of schools, public and private. Most of these schools run in shift system, and they all have different timings. So if a woman has 2 or 3 children, much of her time would just be going in reaching the children to school and picking them back, and through the day she can be doing this. And interestingly, the urban landscape in Mumbai during morning hours and evening hours and afternoon hours are actually filled with women taking their children and reaching them or going home with school backpacks mothers keep carrying. And there are hordes of them. So it's almost like you have migrant women who at one point of time came into the city and worked, move into an aspirational space of trying to get their children educated, and then move from a blue collar scenario to a white collar scenario. So this brings us to the question as to what are urban policymakers and planners actually doing to enable women to come into the labor force. If it is expected that an unpaid person is going to be available full time to be doing all these tasks, fetching water, fetching children, and you also have cities that are not safe. You cannot expect children to walk on their own to go to school and come back, nor are you ready to leave your children behind and go to work because of the kind of violence that children are facing and families are concerned about. If these are not taken up at all, there is no way that work participation rates would increase. So this is an interesting way of looking at ground realities and making connections to see how does one amplify all these observations to inform public policy, to be able to do things differently and recognize unpaid care work and carry out the necessary public provisioning of the same.
In fact, this very idea that one is migrant never occurred to me to begin with, because when you move from one place to another place within your country, this idea of migration looked fictitious to me. I was born and brought up in Bihar, shifted to Delhi for my undergraduate and then graduation and then initial job, and then from there I came to Mumbai. So this conception that I am a migrant was actually not existing for me. But when before coming to Mumbai and otherwise also as a student of political science, I have been hearing about this issue of hostility towards the people moving from Bihar to Maharashtra to other places and things like that, and that made you think about that what is that which makes a migrant life so complicated within their own country, where technically by the constitution you have the right to move and settle anywhere within the country. So it's also a kind of class experience. So for me as a professor at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and for many like me, actually this idea of migration and the problems related to migration not necessarily occur. But when it comes to urban poor, laboring poor, the construction workers, domestic workers and things like that, then this idea that this poor segment as a migrant are not wanted or being considered and framed as the other, and then all the problems exist from there. though the canvas and understanding or the governmental understanding of migration includes most of the people who go for job, for anything outside the place of their residence are considered migrant. But for a social science perspective, from a perspective of the way we are trying to understand the issue of migration, to me it is not so much the white collar professionals, occupants who are the migrants, because the problems associated, the concerns associated with the migration is not necessarily the concern of the white collar and the professionals. It is the concern, as I was telling you earlier, it's the laboring poor. It is people who, because of unforeseen circumstances at their source, or because of the natural disaster, because of farmers and the peasants context in which there is a crisis in the rural area, where they had to leave their villages, places in search of livelihood, in dire need and dire necessity. It can also be because of the caste based and other kinds of conflict at the source in the village, which made them leave and look for a livelihood outside the city. When they come in an extremely difficult situation with an element of deprivation, they try to come and work in the city and meet their basic requirement. But unfortunately, it is these people who live with utmost insecurity, deprivation, they are being made out to be somebody who makes the life of people at destination complicated, not in real sense, but more in political construction. So the othering happens there, that as if they have taken the job opportunity, livelihood opportunity of the people at destination. So to me, it is the laboring poor, it is the people in unorganized sector, people in all kinds of very complex, hard-working, manual work in which they are engaged in. They are the migrants who are our concern for the purpose of the societal and political issues arising out of the issue of migration. So I would say that to me, that's the group, that's the class, and as I was saying, it's a very clearly and starkly a class and caste angle to it. The migrant population, if you look at the literature, if you look at the remittances being sent by the migrants, if you look at the burden they reduce at the source by migrating to destination and to the cities, is something, and the way their movement has been seen in economic terms, it looks and it gives a very rosy picture. People do see that there is a push internationally to allow people to migrate, to facilitate, because the understanding is that it brings economic prosperity. So the international literature is full of saying that how people's mobility, people's movement, migration brings prosperity to both the destination and the source. So if you go by that, the assumption is that the state should facilitate the process, the state should make life comfortable, simpler, less complex for the migrant population. But the reality is starkly different. The state, because they know that particularly looking at the poor migrants, they know that they are moving because of the dire necessity. The state doesn't feel it obligatory on their part to make any special provision for them or make their life in terms of their housing, in terms of their basic services, in terms of their access to health services, access to education, access to livelihood or support of any kind as their obligation. They feel that it is their duty, they will navigate, they will traverse, and they will make things happen for themselves. So at one level, there is an indirect push that people should migrate, but in the process of migration, there is no support being provided, either during their decision to migrate or during their travel or when they come to the destination or the place for their livelihood. So there is no support of that kind. The second is that because of political reasons. As you know, that either the far right group or even the centrist political parties and sometimes even the left groups position migrant as the other, making their life extremely complicated. And in this process of othering, when their life they experiences verbal threat, they experiences physical threat, in those situations the sense of security is completely missing. They have nowhere to go, they have nowhere to seek refuge and rescue to. And that clearly shows that how the state as an institution allows certain fringe groups or political groups to play around the populist politics in a very tangible and sometimes intangible manner, and migrants are often at the receiving end. At another level, when there is an issue of safety, security and safety from the threat and the violence, at that place also the migrants feel very isolated, alienated to take any kind of support from the state. So that, and to me it is an extremely difficult thing to comprehend why the everyday experience with the state is so negative. And what it does is that the migrants then resign to the fact that they are the other. So their bare minimum and the basic premise of claiming citizenship right, that they are the citizens of this country, gets completely compromised. The idea of citizenship is extremely a complicated idea. If you look at the basic premise of citizenship, it has an element of universalism. It has an element of that because you are a citizen, you have such and such rights and privileges being a citizen of particular country and particular society. Now the problem with the migrants is that they don't experience the right to citizenship the way it is envisaged in the constitution. So at one level one can say that the bare minimum civil and political rights of citizens are available to them. So you can say that they have a voter card, you can say that okay, certain things are available. But this larger idea of the social citizenship, which T.H. Marshall and others talked about, is that their socio-economic rights are often being compromised, neglected, ignored completely. So there is an element of experiencing themselves as a differentiated citizen. There is an element of understanding themselves as somebody who experience the idea of citizenship in a hierarchical manner. Citizenship, if you look at the basic premise of citizenship, it has an element of equality. Citizenship gives that okay, everybody has a particular kind of right, but the everyday experience with the state, with society in general, and everyday life of the migrants makes it very clear and obvious to all of us that their life is a life of graduated, differentiated citizenship and hierarchized citizenship, not that the way the citizenship is generally envisaged. So here is the problem, that if you don't consider yourself and you don't experience yourself as a right-bearing citizen of the society, then your engagement with society at large, with the state, has an element of very clear, you can say that it's very uneven, and that defines the life and circumstances of migrants in cities, in places where there is an element of political animosity, political othering, and making them feel unwanted, though they provide cheap labor and therefore they contribute to economy in a very subsidized manner, but at the end their citizenship experience is anything but desired. You know, it's a very interesting thing to identify that why historically certain places are developed, are promoted as destination, and certain places are allowed to remain the source for providing cheap labor. So to me it is the larger canvas of capitalism which certainly wants certain places as the sender, at the certain places as a source. So, if you look at Bihar, Bihar has a fertile land, but the land distribution is very skewed. People, there is a very large section of people who are landless laborers, they belong to Dalit communities or the extremely backward caste communities with barely having any land holding to themselves. So, there is a general crisis around agriculture and the recurring floods in some part of the state and in many other parts of the state recurring droughts. So, it is the contrast within the state which leaves the poorer section with no other option but to leave the place and look out for some kind of livelihood opportunity and wages outside. Now, if you look at the economic development, whether it is green revolution in western UP, Haryana, Punjab, and the way the attention has been given to agriculture or complete lack of or complete absence of any industrial growth in Bihar. So, people and at the top of it there is a huge social hierarchy, the caste hierarchy with experiences of discrimination, experience of exploitation, experiences of violation. So, all this leave no other option but to live and look out for livelihood. So, one is the economic reason, another is the social reason, ultimately that leads to that forces people to go out and look for livelihood opportunity. Now, the destination has changed. So, earlier for Bihar and Bihari migrants and laborers, the destination used to be Bengal, Calcutta, which changed subsequently. People started shifting to Delhi and to Mumbai. If you go by the statistics, you will be astonished to know that the Bihari migrants in Mumbai are actually really very few. Statistics does not support, yes, as far as the UP migrants are concerned, they are in good number, but Bihari migrants are really low in number in the city of Mumbai. Their preferred destination is still Delhi and North India. But at the same time, if you see this very interesting thing that because the UP migrants have also developed a kind of political clout in the city. So, the framing of othering of North Indian migrant through Bihari lens helps the political groups here. So, who has the right over the city and who has the right to the city? Invariably, the city has been appropriated and the right and entitlement has been claimed either by the middle class and the upper class. So, the poor section, the migrants, the poor migrants, again I would like to emphasize, so claim over city has been very minimal. They knew that they have come here for their livelihood, they have resigned to the fact that they have no services available there, and therefore the claim making is negligible. So, they accept that their life is the bare minimum, the biological minimum, the normal life. It had not been a political life in that sense. It was not a life of activity in that sense apart from their work, earning and then those processes. Now, it cannot go on for long with this rapid urbanization, more and more people coming as a migrant from one particular area, one particular region, one particular language, coming together, staying together, developing as a community, also started asserting and making their presence felt in the city. So, when those processes has happened, so it's not, I would say that it's not the academia and civil society who proactively engaged with migrants, sorry, they did not. So, first the migrants made their presence felt through different kind of formation, mobilization, collectivization, and in this process what has happened that the civil society, which for very long tried to ignore migrant as a group to work with, then realized that this entire thing, that how state and society at large, as per their convenience, in the words of some thinker which I am not recalling the name, it says that it's a space of encompassment and closure. So, when you want them, you encompass, you broaden, you take them along for work and the cheap labor and subsidized thing, and when you want certain things restricted, you close that. So, it's that kind of experience which then the academia felt that they need to engage with the migrant population. If you look at the literature, history and research, the migration issue has been internationally dominated too much around the international migration, refugee, asylum seekers and all those things. Internal, the country migration in internationally has been under researched by academia, under attended by academia and the civil society. Now in a country like India, when you started seeing the potential either through remittances or through other thing, both a set of economists started thinking and felt the need of knowing about the migrants more, not necessarily about their experiences, not necessarily about their life and circumstances, more importantly to begin with about what kind of remittances they send, where do they send, what happens to the remittances, how it shapes and helps the state. So that's one way of initial engagement with migration as an issue. Subsequently, the other disciplines also started getting engaged with the migration issue. And then the civil society understood the poor labor migrants, their pathetic working situation, their living condition. Particularly if you look at HIV/AIDS was one thing which brought migration issue into, also brought it into the limelight when people started saying that the kind of living, the kind of space, the kind of situation also led to certain stigma around it. So it's a mix of things. Once that certain health, migrant body as a diseased body, migrant body, so it is the health concern which made the state to look at them, not necessarily improving the situation, but as a problem body, they started looking at it. So it is gradual from an economic perspective to health perspective, then other sociologists, anthropologists and started looking at city space and looking at their life and circumstances, their everyday life in that frame. And in this context, the academia also, both civil society and academia got engaged to understand the migrant better. In due course, what we have done and we have realized that there has also been need by the civil society. They felt that there is a need to collaborate between academia and civil society in order to push forward the cause and concerns of the migrant. So, for example, we have collaborated with civil society organizations who have had concerted work with the migrants, and then we work towards policy papers, the situations, the life and circumstances, and put it forward to the state, to the government for using advocacy for the migrant population. I would say that not in a complete sense of right to the city, but at least pushing for basic amenities, basic services, and to some extent there has been success. But I think that the academia, civil society has miles to go in terms of actually substantively engaging with the concerns, issues and real complex situation of migrants, where there are political issues, there are economic issues, there are social concerns, and I think that kind of concerted effort has gained momentum, but not as much as it requires.
So my name is Shweta, and I'm a migrant to this city. I came as I just finished my college and came to Mumbai, and eventually I settled here. And I've been working with the issue of housing for a very, very long time now, almost 20 years. And in my work, I've been engaging with people from the slums who are largely migrants to the city. And looking at the question of housing has kind of opened up a number of critical questions in front of me, and critical in terms of security, in terms of legality, in terms of redevelopment, evictions, in terms of what infrastructure means to it, them, how the infrastructure of the city, how do you see the infrastructure of the city in relation to a informal population that is living in slums, livelihood spaces that are present in various slums, the question of single male migrants and how they are victimized because of their status of being single within that milieu of slums. A larger part of my work, I've worked in a slum called Behrampara, which is at Bandra East, right outside the station, and there's a huge population of single male. There used to be a huge population of single male migrant workers, and they were occupied in various small enterprises, which were run from the tenements there. And for them they actually, this is something very interesting. We assumed that they would want to make a foothold in the city, but no, they weren't really interested in making a foothold in the city. They knew that their working life is short because the kind of labor that they do, would kind of any which ways diminish their working life by a few years. So they did not want to stay in the city, so they just purely came here to work, and them being very young, they were not included as a part of the community that they were also living. So there was always a threat that these young boys would elope with the young girls from the community. So they were always kept at bay. So their access to amenities, for that matter, if there is a scarcity of water, or there is a big queue for toilets, they were the first to be shunted out. जाओ बाहर चले जाओ, कहीं और चले जाओ, अकेले तो in Mumbai they call it छड़े भाई. छड़े भाई हो तो चले जाओ, तुम कहीं भी यूज कर सकते हो. And the kind of work that they did, they were engaged in the garment industry, so long hours of work, and then they would assemble sometime during midnight, so would be picked up by the police, and and then would be questioned for any theft that's happened around and things like that. So for them, of course, it's a very, very difficult. Though after demonetization, many of these units have closed down. So they obviously have been absorbed in other. But all these boys never aspired or never wanted to live in Mumbai all their life. They never wanted to, kind of make Mumbai their home. Their home was back from where they were. And they were from all parts of India, interestingly. They were not just from Bihar, Bengal, as it is largely assumed, but they also came from MP, they came from Rajasthan, they came from parts of Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu. So it was not just about Bihar and Bengal, the poorer states of India. They were from all over. The popular notion is that slum dwellers migrants हैं, या फिर गरीब migrants हैं. People who are poor, who don't have formal housing for that sense, are migrants. And the adjectives that I use कि छड़े भाई, बांग्लादेशी, अभी आए हैं, वागरी हैं, वो ऐसे ही हैं. These are the kind of adjectives largely used, but primarily it's informal housing, which is one identity that the migrants hold. Though many of them have been living in the city for many, many years. Apart from the coolies, everyone who came to Mumbai are migrants. So housing, anyways, which ways is a big question in the city. 45% of the 42.6% approximately population lives in the slums, which are informal settlements, not acknowledged by the government, and there's some certain amount of arbitrariness about they're being recognized as the citizens of the city. The one thing in context to housing which comes across very and as one of the very important issues which kind of relates to the dignity of life is the access to amenities, the access to amenities like toilets. During my engagement, when I spoke to residents, I could never have thought of the kind of things that they were saying. That आपको पता है मैं इनफॉर्मल ऑक्यूपेशंस में ही काम कर सकता हूँ, फॉर्मल में मुझे 9 बजे ऑफिस पहुँचना होगा और इतनी लंबी क्यू है टॉयलेट की कि मैं नहीं कभी भी 9 बजे पहुँच. वन डोमेस्टिक हेल्प सेड दॅट आता रोज उशिरा पोचले तर मला घरात कामातनं काढून नाही का देणार. There's a girl who works in one of these malls, the newer form of employment that have cropped up, and she uses the toilets only at night because she says if I even attempt to use it in the morning, I'll be late and then I'll be thrown out of the job. So access to amenities like potable water and toilets is a big issue that is so closely related to housing. The other thing about the housing question is the legality, it being legal or illegal. Even if you look at the history of any protection that is provided for slum housing, it has been the cut-off dates that have been, from 85 to 95 to 2000 to 2001 and then 11, and now everything under PMAY, but nothing is moving. So the tenurial security in that sense and is the second biggest question. Redevelopment itself, which is again submitting yourself to the market and market being the magic wand to provide all solutions. It's a very subtle way of victimizing people, displacing them. Redevelopment does all of it. So it's state violence, but violence of the state. A lot of these migrant workers also operate from their homes, from the slum itself, and there's this huge population which services their own kind, which largely operates from the slum. Like if there's a slum dweller and there's a catering business and he or she caters to only people from the slum. So there is a huge economy like this which is existent in the slum. And with redevelopment, everything is going away. All these workspaces are going away. So it's very, very important to make space for these workspaces within the city. That's one. The other discourse that's largely happening is how do you there are these two streams. So you look at the people as citizens or look at the people as workers. Whereas I very strongly feel that it has to be a mix of both. If you're a citizen, you pay money to get services. If you're a worker, then your citizenship rights don't come into any discourse. So there has to be a mix of both of these for to make them more inclusive. Like informal workers live in slums. They need their houses protected. They need their workspaces protected to survive in the city. And ultimately, they are subsidizing the larger economy. Now with redevelopment happening and with the new development regulations in place, a lot of amenities for the city is going to come by way of redevelopment, and a lot of infrastructure is also going to be created. And these infrastructures which are coming up are primarily of the pay and use kind, or it requires entry fees and things like that. Some services cannot be, it has to be open to larger people, and that's where you will be able to, in real sense of the term, have a mix of diversity in many senses. If all the policies attempt to segregate people as rich and poor, there will be clashes all along. So it is very undemocratic to do it. So there has to be provisions where the government more proactively takes up initiative in developing infrastructure, own it, biggest housing question, the question of housing. The developers are investing because they want to make money. There are possibilities of government taking up leadership roles and not being mere facilitators to provisioning of housing. Market cannot be a solution to things. We can have migrant colonies, we can have rented accommodation for people to live in, and they can operate from there. And they don't, many migrants in my experience, many migrants don't come to the city to make this their home. So they come here to work, they come here, many of them come, there are many students who come to the city. Where do we have students hostels? Where do we have working women's hostel? There are many women who come to the city to work. So we don't have any provisions for these things. At one level, when they wanted people to come in and work in the various industries that were coming up, they welcomed them, but they did not really understand their needs. They never made an attempt in understanding their needs and creating adequate infrastructure for the city to cater to these incoming migrant workers. And at one level, they were in the phase of denial, and a phase of denial from the fact that हमको नहीं चाहिए migrant work, मुंबई को और लोग नहीं चाहिए. At one point of time, this discussion becomes relevant when the population has swelled to the level that it is right now. But just talking about it wouldn't help. You have to have corrective measures in terms of creating more employment at their sources and things of this kind. So the government has been knowingly ignorant and overlooking this entire question of migration. Helping women understand and articulate, their demands and taking it to, we have to be a bridge between. Civil society needs to be a bridge between, the policy discourse and what is existing in the real life. I very strongly feel that academic institutions have to come forward to understand and to bring forth empirical data, for that matter, as well as some qualitative data to, kind of articulate the needs of women in context to housing specifically. In Mumbai, it's very difficult because there's a paucity of low cost. There's no paucity of housing. Mumbai is housing rich, but it's poor for one particular class. So if you talk in context of Mumbai, then one has to really talk about the housing for the poor, the housing for slum dwellers, so that articulation has to come out very strongly. Those needs have to be really studied and brought forward. And that's one role that the civil society has to play very actively. There are experiments that are happening across the city, so one needs to, but obviously all organizations don't have the agency to be able to reach out to policymakers, so somehow we have to collaboratively come together and look at the best practices and take it to the policymakers. And these are the ways that we can probably.
Presently, I am part of a studio, a car-based studio called Camp, where I am working on an archival project, archiving the history of the city from a perspective of people's history and looking at the like how the situation or the condition we are in today, how we have reached here where we are. So at one level, if one looks at say like 2 centuries of the history of migration or the history of migrants, so I can see that there are like clearly like 3 sort of phases or responses to the question of migrants, the way state or the state agencies have addressed. And there are certain overlaps in the cultural realm of it. And one thing which I would like to very much specify is that if one looks at the trajectory of the city, again the history of the geographical landmass which we call Bombay is very much and its urban avatar is very much concomitant with the trajectory of the process of migration. So in a way, the narrative of the story of the migration and the story of transformation of land of this landmass as a urban center, these two threads, they run parallel and they are intertwined. And in a way, if one has to take out the thread of migration, it would also mean unpacking the urban trajectory of Bombay, because it's only when the process of migration starts that the process of urbanization of the Bombay it starts. So these are two very sort of intertwined processes, which means that the way the migrants are being treated or they are being understood is also the way the city is developing. So which means that there is a cause and effect relationship between the two. So starting with, as there is this sort of narrative which goes around that like there were 7 islands, and then from Portuguese it got transferred to British, and the British started the process of urbanization of the city, and then these 7 islands, they sort of were clubbed together and it became one single landmass, and that's how the city of Bombay came into being. And from earlier it was a port city, and from port it became trading into like from initially from opium, then from raw cotton, then to setting up of the cotton mills, and then like manufacturing of say like chemicals or metal industry, and then the recent transformation of Bombay as a city of services, whether it is entertainment or whether it is a financial hub. So now this sort of 250 years of like these series of transformations is, it also sees a series of in-migrations, because only like the initial, like when the Bombay transforms as a harbor or as a port, it was only only when the East India Company invited the shipbuilders from Surat, the family of Vadiyas, that they migrated, and then the shipbuilding and the port activities started emerging. And along with them became the traders, whether they were Memons or the Khojas or the Marwadis or the Jains, that the who were dealing with the opium trade along with the East India Company. And then when it transforms into like from opium to opium is replaced by cotton, raw cotton, then raw cotton is coming from central India, Madhya Pradesh or Rajasthan, and or from rural Maharashtra, that another sort of round of in-migration starts, where people are those who are involved into loading and unloading, or into the keeping clerical records of the trade activity that is happening. And then from when it transforms into like the major ports, for which you have labor coming from as far as China, Chinese labor, those who are involved in the construction of the docks, or the Kamathis, those who coming from Nizam or Andhra Pradesh, those who are involved in the construction, or from the Nadars from Tamil Nadu, or like these, like a number of communities and people, they come and they start or they become very much part of the transformation of the this land mass into, from 7 islands which were also the villages, and into a single land mass. So these ways, these two sort of trajectories and histories are very much intertwined. And so what are known as, or what is claimed as to be the indigenous communities, so whether it is the Kolis or the Agris or the Bhandaris, so at one level they were aloof of all these processes, because they were engaged in the primordial activities of, say, fishing or paddy cultivation or toddy tapping, and they remained sort of involved in those activities only. But the sort of the spectacular transformation that the city underwent, whether it is the port related activities or whether it is the industrialization of the city or the post industrial phase of the city, these 3-4 communities who claim to be the indigenous communities, they were not part of that process, and it was the only the communities or the people who were quote unquote not from here, they were part of this process of transformation. But then, because it was all this transformation was just not a simple transformation, but it was under the project of colonization. So there were colonial rulers who were aided in and supported by some of the native populations, that there was like this aspect of extraction that was happening there, and which meant that the extraction that was happening of the profits of the labor, that was the reason, the way the migrant population was understood. So the very first response in the, as I said, in the middle of the 19th century was in an act which was passed, which talked about the worthy and the unworthy migrant. So one, you labeled human population, human bodies as migrant, and you didn't stop there, the colonial rulers didn't stop there, they further classified them into wanted or unwanted. So what is the wanted and the unwanted? Now this, the criteria was the work. So all the human bodies which according to the colonial rulers were worthy or were participating in this process of transformation that was taking place, they were labeled as wanted, and those who were not, according to their own standards, were not participating enough in that process of transformation, they were labeled as unwanted, and further they were described as vagabonds or as beggars. So the Beggary Act is the first sort of an legal intervention which sort of makes a distinctions between people and human bodies as wanted and unwanted, and it gave the colonial rulers the power and the authority to remove them. So at that time, those migrants who according to them were not worthy or were not engaged in the idea of work, they could be labeled as beggars and they could be removed outside the boundary of the city. And now this is the first sort of a response. The way one understand human bodies as migrant, as someone who has come, because at one level, so initially, so if one looks into say like 17th or 18th century records, the population of these 7 islands and these villages was less than 10,000 people. So from 10,000, the way sort of if you look at, so everyone post that 10,000 is coming from somewhere, is coming from outside, and even these 10,000, so it's a question of, is a matter of time. So if you go back 500 years, there will be another narrative about who is here and who has come from outside. If you go like 1000 years back, there will be another narrative or another story. So according to me, there is no sort of a like a objective or a clear cut idea of to differentiate between who is original or who's an outsider, because these boundaries are also sort of are a result of a human intervention, that okay, you mark a boundary in the sense, and then you say that okay, this is the boundary, and who is outside of the boundary is an outsider. When it comes about migrants and migration, or the understanding the or conceptualizing the idea of migration, I feel is that it remains very much focused around around human beings. So if one looks at the, say, the trajectory of migration in the city of Bombay, the narrative is about people and the communities that come, and who gets what, and who plays what role, and who gets vulnerable, or what's the politics that happens around, while totally missing out and erasing out the aspect that that the people never travel alone, or it's not that it's the people who travel, but then it can be that or it is that people travel with things, people travel with ideas, or it can be other way around, that it is the things and the ideas that moves people. So there are certain ideas or there are certain things that makes people travel, people migrate. So if one looks into the like the trajectory of the Bombay city, so one can clearly see or mark certain aspects which sort of further exemplify this, that so if one takes, say, example of cotton mill, and it's like the transformation of the city from a port to an industrial center, the whole industrial trajectory, and if one takes the raw cotton as a commodity, then so the rather than making people in the center, or community, or the mill worker in the center, and then looking at the whole around that worker or the mill owner, the raw cotton can be placed in the center, and then one can see that how a object, a thing, sort of moved people, and how people sort of drew, attracted or were forced, in the sense that like when the process of the capital formation or capital extraction is going on, so there are certain people who got attracted to it. So that way the mill owners, who were initially mostly the Parsis, those who got attracted into around raw cotton, because that could be initially traded and later processed into cloth. And there were other certain people, like say the Marathas from the Konkan, who got pushed towards the cotton, because they could provide labor that could be used to transform the raw material into a finished product that could be further traded. Now, which means that so it is, the migration is just not about people, it's also about things, in the sense that, so if when the cotton mills were being set up, cotton mills a fuel was required to run it, and this fuel as coal was coming from Australia. Now, which means that when object is coming from Australia to Bombay, there will be sort of certain transformations which will be felt within, say, from where the coal mining is being done, or the people who are engaged in the transportation of coal from Australian coast to the ports of Bombay. So there will be new set of people who will be then pulled down that process. If one looks into the trajectory of the city, it was initially it was opium. So it was the trade of opium that sort of brought in people here. So opium, which was not cultivated here, which was being cultivated again in central India, was traded by East India Company, which attracted the initial, say, like Tatas or the Wadias or the Jamshedji Jiji boys or the Sassoons to sort of come to the city, get involved in the trade, and the opium then which was going to China, which led to the first round of capital formation in the city, which then further is transferred into the trade of raw cotton or later into the setting up of the cotton mills, which sort of then leads to another rounds of migrations. So it's the migration is the migration of human beings is always concomitant and supplemented by migration of ideas and objects. There's another aspect which is linked to the whole process of migration is that, so most of the time, most of the academic works or the journal talking about migration looks at migrants as vulnerable categories and how the process of migration leads to like inducing of or forcing them into more vulnerable conditions. And I think like in that that way of framing or understanding this whole trajectory, one misses out on the liberatory aspect of it, which is that if one looks at the caste and the patriarchal aspect of Indian society, then the city comes with the promise, and the promise is of the of liberation. And now this debate can be very well or easily summed up in the debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar, where Gandhi understood or sort of propagated villages as little republics, and in response to which Ambedkar said that villages are not like these little republics, but they are the dens of whatever is wrong with human civilization can be seen in Indian villages. And that's why he sort of said that one way of fighting the caste system is that you leave the village and you come to the city. And by this, what he meant or what one can sort of infer is that like a city or an urban mode of living or the urban or a way of organizing of society is that like a city provide for certain sort of freedoms and which are in different aspects of life. And one aspect is that here your the occupation what one can take upon is not sort of predetermined by one's birth, which is a hallmark of the caste system. And in a village setting, the escape routes are very minimal of that, which is not the case in city, in the sense that there the escape routes are more, and education then becomes one of the vehicle to achieve that. And that's how like one of the reasons, so when one understands migration, so most of the analysis is around the economic factors of migration, and which then further get divided into the push or the pull factors. But these sort of cultural aspects, which are at the same time very much economical also and social also, and as well as political, that people come to the city because there are certain set of freedoms that are available, which are not available that much in a village, or the resistance if one has to experience those freedoms in a village setting will be much more, and then the resistance in the city will be much less. And same applies to the aspect of gender also, that the possibilities of sort of being able to engage or negotiate or struggle with the patriarchal setup, the possibilities in a city are much more, because the way the urban life is itself constituted in the city. So that way I would say that if one approaches the question of city or migration from the framework of vulnerability, then one is totally going to miss out these aspects. Now, while I say this, I don't mean to sort of romanticize also in the sense that saying that okay, there is no caste which is in the city. Yes, definitely caste is still operates. Just one fact that most of the, if one looks at the caste profile of the conservancy staff workers of the municipal corporation, and the fact that they come from a particular caste even till date, means that the caste is operating. But at the same time, the possibilities to negate that is also much more in the city, in the sense that if one looks at the web of the relationships or the density of interactions an individual undergoes in a day-to-day life, that density of interactions is much more that a village setting can provide, which means that in that density itself is rich enough to sort of to for people to lead to aspire to urban living. But then this aspect cannot be cached if the framework is of vulnerability. One will have to change the framework, in the sense that a simple example, that if I was in a village now, my range of interactions, day-to-day interactions with people, with processes, with ideas, and the density which if I am in an urban setting, how much to diverse sort of people and ideas I can interact in any given day is much more. Now this is sort of an incentive even for the vulnerable sections of the people, which then one totally misses out, because one is just operating into the framework of, say, the economic factors. But if one has to catch the reality, then one would have to go beyond the economic indicators and look into the day-to-day interactions and the possibilities an urban life or migration makes possible.
So Rahul and me started working together about 12 years ago. We created a collective called Herbs, and we look at neighborhoods from the point of view of the people who live in the neighborhood. So we have a kind of ethnographic approach. We think that the main central part of understanding any neighborhood are the people who live in it and how they shape it. So we're really, really interested specifically in places which have not been planned, which have not been, let's say, created by architects, by engineers, but which have been shaped over the years by inhabitants. That's a starting point. So it's really bringing together anthropology and urban planning. And then within this, we go into many directions.
Yeah, so basically for us, it was also important to look at urban planning and the whole idea of design, architecture, that space as a space where we could apply, in a sense, in a more organic sense, a lot of the learnings from anthropology. So we saw urban planning and anthropology working together, and also the point of commonality was the notion of agency. That as when you often try to understand what neighborhoods and localities are, you realize that people are already creating a sense of what that neighborhood means. and that in the realm of urban planning, there's the official or the sort of more formal aspects of that try to impose a grid on that, on that process. And that we felt that, I mean, Matthias comes from a tradition of urban planning where, in fact, agency is valued, and the best neighborhoods come from the point of view of, more active engagement from residents and inhabitants. So it was just a very natural connect, because our impulses were very similar and we came from slightly different spaces. But then we felt that this coming together is important, both for the kind of intellectual tradition or the kind of practice we come from, as well as what we felt was a socially responsible space to create.
We met in Mumbai, and Mumbai, of course, has been a city which, from the point of view of our approach and our interest, was very interesting, because a large part of the population is living in neighborhoods which that we call homegrown, which have been built from within. So we see agency at work at its fullest, collective, individual. We see initiative, and we see what happens when this is kind of the default way in which a neighborhood gets structured. So Mumbai, from that point of view, has shaped our practice. It has really informed us on what happens when people actually create their own neighborhoods. We know that historically it happened in many other cities, and we've been working a lot on Tokyo also before, which historically has been built incrementally after the war, and really also from within the neighborhoods. And Mumbai is a case study which is really interesting for us, because it's still ongoing, it's still happening. Of course, the difficulty in Mumbai, and also something which is interesting to us, is the kind of conflicted situation that these neighborhoods are in vis-a-vis the state, which always has this kind of idea of redeveloping, and this idea that what is going on in those neighborhoods is not legitimate, that they should actually, that people are squatters. This is really something that we try to work against. I mean, this is more like, let's say, the activist part of our work, where we say that no, actually, those processes are legitimate, that those neighborhoods should not be dismissed as slum or informal. We say that actually what qualifies them more than anything else is constant organization at the community level and initiative. So we need to recognize those forms, and we need to recognize how they shape and that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with them.
In fact, one very important characteristic of Mumbai is the presence of community organization. People, not just as an abstraction, but people organize through community histories, through regions, with their language, culture, and whether we are talking about working class neighborhoods. I mean, Mumbai comes alive when we actually use that lens to see how people have organized themselves. And homegrown settlements, the kind of settlements where we are working from, which dominate the landscape, in some way also emerged from an older set of agency which existed even before that. So from the 19th century onwards, Old Bombay, Girgaon, Kalbadevi, all of those spaces and neighborhoods had the same impulses and processes. So for us, it is very important to locate our present engagement also with what the history of the city has been, and to see continuities. And the point of continuity for us was the communities themselves. So in the sense that, what is generally known and spoken about the city of Mumbai is the fact that it is a city of migrants. Its genesis is really based on more and more people coming here to be part of the trading history, to be part of the history of docks. There was an older history, shaped by Portuguese colonialism, and then on top of that you had a new layer of a much more recent, relatively recent English colonial history, and all of that ultimately became a space for attracting migrant groups from all over. And these, these communities shaped a lot of the city's modern self-perception. That it was also at a time when the world was modernizing, was dealing with industrialization, and Mumbai never saw itself as sort of out of the global imagination. So it was always part of it. It had a huge flow of global migrants right from the 18th century, 19th century onwards, At the same time, it had a huge number of people coming from within the subcontinent. It was always part of a larger imaginary of the Bombay state. You know, definitely from the English colonial sort of period onwards, there was a sense in which Bombay was not just the city, it was a region. And in that region, you had Karachi from Pakistan, you had Ratnagiri, you had Sindhudurg, you had parts of Karnataka. All of that contributed to the Bombay imaginary. And this flow of people coming and going, and this is very important for us, because right from the start we felt that the cultural diversity of the city is based on a dynamism of mobility and not just migration. Migration sort of implies today a sense of a one-way unidirectional flow. Whereas what is more true of Mumbai, and what we can see clearly embedded in so many of its institutions, whether it is the Goan Kuds or those dormitories meant for people coming from Mangalore and from Udupi, the restaurants themselves, fueled by labor coming in all the time from the region, that for us it was very important to talk about both migration and mobility and this flow and a larger imaginary which made Mumbai and which made Bombay. So yeah, that is something which we feel is very organic to the city. In the case of Mumbai and Ratnagiri specifically, the city was shaped a lot by the migratory flows from Ratnagiri in particular. So we came across Rajchandravarkar's work and the whole industrial mill labor. Neera Adarkar and Meena Menon have written about it. And that meant that at one point of time, a majority of the textile workers were actually from Ratnagiri district at that time, which included Sindhudurg alone. And that a lot of the city's modern identity, particularly its socialist bearings, the trade unions, all of these were rooted in active connections to the villages. They were not necessarily, to be understood in the classical sense of becoming urban. And so many historians have talked about that. Our own observations saw when we, we're looking at BDD chawls, looking at neighborhoods in Bhandup, where a lot of the residents come from Ratnagiri, and then of course in Dharavi as well, seeing third generation residents return back to villages from wherever they come from. So this for us meant that that we needed to relook at the processes of urbanization, which otherwise always look at a default model of a one-way street, which is a one-way destination towards the city. And this, as urbanists, as people who are looking at urban practice and taking part in debates around urbanization, was very important, because to imagine that the city has to be only visualized in a certain way, that it is only the form of of habitat, or modern habitat, and that the 19th century, early 20th century city should be the normative, is something which we felt needed to be questioned a little. And we felt that by talking about migratory flows and challenging the notion that the city is becoming crowded and dense only because of people coming to the city, is a slightly oversimplified argument. And then we began to understand what is happening in other parts of the world. We found that in many parts of Africa, many parts of China, they are called the dual household families, one household in the city, one in the village. We found so much of research from the 70s and 80s, right from classical sociologists saying the same thing, whether it's K.M. Kapadia, whether it is A.M. Shah, all of them talking about much more complex models, which never get reflected in our understanding of urban policy. Because urban policy is all about urbanizing and development and seeing one as the marker of the other and insisting that this is the way it is. And in fact, of course, a lot of it is true. A lot of that kind of urbanization is indeed the case. However, it is not the full story. And if it is not the full story, we needed to understand that. And we felt that, to talk about India as being, only 27% urbanized or 30% urbanized was a very reductive way of understanding urbanism, particularly in a context of, where there's so much of mobility of labor. And we also looked at the railways. The railway network is a very special network in India, where a worker can travel across the subcontinent at a fraction of the cost what he or she would have to pay in any other part of the world, which means that this is definitely shaping the history. And of course, our Konkan study was complicated because the Konkan migration happened before the railways. So railways are not even needed for the mobility. So it was the steamer ship, it was the road, it was walking, it was. So we felt that mobility is a very intrinsic part of labor movement, of the way in which urban landscapes are shaped and changed, and that to talk in terms of to talk about urbanization only as a demographic shift of people from rural to urban is just one part of the story. So all these elements came out in our study and research.
We followed families. We followed families from Mumbai who were also rooted in the Konkan, and we looked at how they shaped the landscape, because we know that we knew very well that those families were representative of million others. We basically took very representative families who live in parts of the city where pretty much everybody comes from the Konkan coast. So we just saw that in the village where they were coming from, about pretty much all the families had half of their members in the city. So this is a prevailing condition. I mean, and we saw, for us, the interest was always to look at what does that do for the city, what does that do for the village, and what does that do for the family. And the big thing that connected everything was mobility. You know, we saw that actually, I mean, there's a circulatory urbanism being generated through the movement back and forth of people, and the villages are part of this. They're already part of this urban world through the movement of people. So people go back to get married. They go back to reinvest in the houses. In fact, to build the dream urban house that they cannot afford in the city. So, you know, they go back to recreate urban lifestyles in the village, which they cannot afford in the city. They go back, you know, for nature. They go back for many, many different reasons. They go back, of course, for community and for resources. But at the same time, they do also go back to the city, because the city offers access to resources, income, education, healthcare, because there's another sense of community and freedom over there, and opportunity. So both places are equally important in a lifelong strategy of a family.
At one level, you know, focusing on housing as if it is part of a provision which has to be given, which is also, you know, which reflects, you know, a broad socialist concern, is very valid, very important, and we in the state has to intervene. The point is that that when housing becomes something which is now part of an economic arrangement, where rather than the state, you actually now are subcontracting housing to be given out by builders, and it is connected to speculation and real estate development projects. Now we are talking about something else altogether. And so the thing is that in Mumbai, you know, the residents themselves have always taken the lead historically. One of the first cooperative housing societies were in Mumbai. The city at one point of time, you know, had much more elaborate arrangements of giving leaseholds, of creating rental stock, of you know, encouraging people to build homes which could be given out for renting. And a lot of the city's sort of way in which it provided for both housing and accommodation, and we feel it's important to distinguish between the two, you know, is related to a lot of active engagement of the residents in different forms. And it was not necessarily based on the fact that everybody needs to own property. The idea was that everybody needs to have you know, a decent access to housing and accommodation. And therefore, rental stocks were very important, the whole process of providing rental. So in a sense, when we talk about you know, the mobility and migration of people as a self-evident aspect of all modern cities, when the city starts to expand and, you know, open up space for it, it is not about scarcity anymore. But when the whole idea of housing is reduced to you know, just providing individual units to people and to families, then you are also disregarding the so many other ways in which people actually organize themselves. And also it is now co-opted completely by the real estate and the builder lobby, who have sort of, you know, harnessed the need for housing into something which becomes capital for them. And this also happened, you know, from the 90s onwards, with the whole SRA, you know, moving away from self-development into builder-led development. So this is something which we feel, you know, needs to be unpacked and understood more systematically. A lot of people in the city have been working on that, and all we can say is that that there are so many different arrangements. We do not necessarily have, we must be careful that in the name of housing rights, we are privatizing land and privatizing housing. This needs to be questioned, because there are many ways in which they can be people can have occupancy rights, they can have secure tenure, they can have collective ownership of rights, they can have cooperative housing. All these models which were part of the city's history are all now being disbanded. So one has to be careful when talking about housing rights in a flat way.
Yeah, when we talk about when we go to the question of housing and access, we immediately kind of go back to this notion of the right to the city. Again, Henri Lefebvre, which is again becoming very popular now and lots very debated. And of course, it seems like the most progressive kind of notion, the right to the city. But we really have to ask the right to what exactly in the city. I mean, is it the right to housing? Because if it's the right to housing, then we enter a logic which is of mass housing, production of mass housing. In fact, this is really what a lot of very progressive, let's say, NGOs and activists have been fighting for. More mass housing, and the left is really strongly pushing for that kind of agenda, which in fact dovetails into a more right-wing agenda of just real estate, development and speculation generally. So for us, we just want to be a bit careful about this and say that the right to the city is a right to access, and is a right to opportunity, is a right to having the same opportunities, or at least a right to be able to develop an activity in the city, develop a relationship, which can be a productive one. So this is important. And what do you need for this? You don't necessarily need housing in the conventional sense. What you need is to be able to accommodate yourself there. You need a point of entry. So you need mobility systems which allow you to come, and you need a city which is welcoming to migrants, and at least on a temporary basis. And then yes, from there it can be a launching pad to staying, forever. Moving with the family or anything like this, or it could be a point of of like, okay, I mean, if you can easily go back to the city, then you don't necessarily need to have like a permanent house over there. If you can have this relationship. So yeah, the right to access and the right to accommodation for us is really really important in terms of how we look at the city.
We don't see ourselves as representing larger collectives. We have also taken a position of creating a small independent space with which is essentially a practice-based space. So at the location of our office, looking at our work as an office, as a bureau, and where we provide whether it's design related, research related, services of different kinds, and embedded in the neighborhood. Along with that, we feel that we are part of a dialogue, and we are aware that we also have research and we have other academic skills. All of these show a relationship to the neighborhood and community which is based on different levels of collaborations. So we can work with local contractors who are building homes in neighborhoods. We have worked with universities at the same time, or doing projects of design collaboratively, where students of engineering come and they work around us in our neighborhoods and apply different kinds of skills which they have learned. So our collaborations are really of different kinds, which reflect different projects and larger abstractions of communities and collectives, which we are fully aware are very have been a very important part of the discussion about urbanization, about how urban spaces operate, civil society organizations. We whenever there are interactions, we interact. But we are a little wary of using very large abstractions in understanding the context in which we are working. So we feel that neighborhoods are made of different. So of course there are organizations, for example, who are the Koli Jamaat, which is a kind of local residential fishermen's organization, which organizes itself as and it is engaged in building different kinds of projects. So yes, we have a relationship with them. We work with them very closely. So one of our colleagues belongs to a community of traditional broom makers, and he's part of our office, but there's also a connection which he has through his whole network, and therefore we have an engagement with that. So these are more organic ways in which we connect, and we are, it's difficult for us to say that, we are, and of course when we talk with the state, yeah, we are talking to the BMC representatives all the time. We have to design, we designed a small space for women and children, which had to be built on top of a public toilet. So to get permissions, we had to be constantly working with the bureaucracy and the local. So in that sense, we must remember that there are different ways in which we can, contribute and become part of. And while we understand and value the language which looks at community organizations, civil society organizations through bigger abstract categories, there are also other ways in which people relate to collectives in very particular terms. So we are, because of the way we are not part of larger, we don't see ourselves located in these abstractions. We have developed a network of collaborations of different kinds.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add to this that it's true that being who we are, we cannot claim to be representative of any community or any constituency. In fact, the only thing that we can represent is diversity, because we're diverse, and this is our strength, and also our experience. I mean, because we work directly hands-on in the neighborhood, we do have relationship. Which are and understanding, which are shaped by our practice. So that knowledge that we gain, this we can talk about, and we can talk about it confidently, because it's really something that we've kind of like this is really part of it has shaped our understanding and shaped who we are. So this is we can talk about, but we're really careful never to talk on behalf of other people, and this is something we learned very quickly in Dharavi, because this is where we have shaped a lot of our practice, is that anybody who claims to talk on behalf of Dharavi, whoever that person is probably saying something which is going to be contested by at least half of the people in Dharavi. The diversity is the defining characteristic of that place.